In the book of Psalms, the 8th chapter, there is this question: What is man that thou art mindful of him, and the Son of Man that thou visitest him? Thou hast made him but a little lower than angels. Thou hast crowned him with glory and honor. The psalmist David, in this psalm, was extolling the all as to the position that God has placed man in, and thus ponders, why should man be placed in such a position as that? When we look at the question, what is man, we recognize that, of course, Christians and believers say man is a created being. But the atheist says, no, not so. There is no God. And since he believes there's no God, then man was not created by God. So he has to explain, well, according to your understanding, where did man come from? And he says, well, man is a creature of evolution. There was a cell a billion of years ago, and it began to grow and evolved. And over those billion years, it has developed into man. Now it's our time for questions. And our question is, Mr. Atheist, where did that cell come from? And he's much at a loss to explain where that cell came from, as he expects that I am to explain where God came from. The truth of the matter is that there is an old principle that, though it's old, it's still true, and that is, something is, and we have to acknowledge something is, and therefore something always was. We can look, we can see our world around, the world on which we walk, of which we're going to live until we die. And then we can look at the skies above, and at night we can see the twinkling stars millions and billions of miles away. And as we look at the stars, there is the question that God asked Abraham long ago. Look at the skies. Count the stars. If you can count them, you can know how many descendants you're going to have. And of course, the answer is indeterminable. For we are told that there are billions of stars. And as we look in all of that universe above, and even our planet Earth, we are awed by the massive power that had to be exercised in the bringing of our world into existence. And as we look at the world around, all around, we see on every hand design. We see laws, we call them laws of nature. We see how that it is set in order, that there is our sun, and the earth revolves around it. And there are moons, and the moons revolve around the earth. And we see that these are held in place by a law that we call the law of gravity that God set in motion when the world was formed. We look at the power that's exercised by some massive being, and we look at the design, and we see wisdom and law and design. And where there is wisdom and law and design, there has to be a designer. And thus we look at the massive power and a designer, and we call that being God. The Bible teaches us that God created the world, and then he began to make different creations on this world, separated the light from darkness, the earth, dry land from the seas. And then on the sixth day, when he was about to complete his work of creation, God said, let us make man in our likeness and enter our image, and let them have dominion over all of the creatures of the earth and of the sea and the sky above. And so God did create man. And in his likeness and in his image. When we look at that, we find the origin of man. And the psalmist, as we noted in the beginning, asked this question wonderingly, what is man? And while the psalmist was considering the very status of man himself, why he should be occupying the position that he does in this world, and what is there about him that causes that he should deserve that? Then we find the Hebrew writer likewise quotes the same psalm and applies it to Jesus Christ the Lord. And he does so because Jesus is the perfect man. And when we look at the beginning and in day 6, and God's saying, let's make man in our image and after our likeness, we know that the record goes on to say that God created from the dust the body of Adam. And then God breathed into Adam's nostrils the breath of life. And so Adam became a living soul. Adam has two parts, or Adam had two parts to him. He had a body that was created from the earth. And then he had created and breathed in his nostrils the breath of life and something else. God created Adam in his likeness, his character. When Solomon wrote, he wrote the book of Proverbs and the Song of Solomon, and he wrote also Ecclesiastes. And in Ecclesiastes, he examined certain things that pondered him, and he was questioned about. And he talked about man. And as he talks about man, and finally the ultimate end of man, here is what he said. He said, and then the dust shall return unto the dust as it was, and the spirit shall return to God that gave it. Solomon simply emphasized what Moses in the Genesis record wrote of the nature of man. Part of man belongs to this earth. That's his body. But part of man is that came from God. And that part that came from God is everlasting. It's eternal. We find at the death of man, his body does go back to the dust. But his spirit does not die. God has a place for it. It's called Hades, the unseen. Or sometimes it's simply called hell. And thus we find that when Lazarus, the poor man, the beggar, lay at the rich man's gate, desiring even the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table, he died. His body did go back to the dust, but his spirit didn't die. It went back to the Father. He was in Abraham's bosom, under the oversight, the protection, and the care of God. And when the psalmist David spake of his Son that was to come, Jesus, he spake as though it were himself personally. And he said, my tongue rejoices, my heart is glad, because thou wilt not leave thy Holy One to see corruption. You will not leave my soul in hell. And thus, as the psalmist spake, and spake of the fact that there is a part of me that goes back to God, then we have to recognize that man is a twofold being. Now, there is also another aspect that we need to consider about man. And as we look in the writings of Paul in 1 Thessalonians, the 5th chapter, the apostle there speaks of a desire for these brethren, that God would preserve them entire, their soul and body and spirit. Paul speaks of man as being a composite of body and soul and spirit. Sometimes the word soul is used in the scriptures to describe the eternal part of man. Sometimes it is used to describe man as a living being, as describing the soul as far as the eternal part of man. We see that in Matthew, the 16th chapter, where Jesus asks the question, what shall a man be profited if he gain the whole world and lose his soul? What shall a man give in exchange for his soul? We see it found also in Psalms, the 16th chapter, but quoted by Peter in Acts, the 2nd chapter, in which that David said, you will not leave my soul in Hades, neither will you give your Holy One to see corruption. That's David in the long ago. And as we look in the Scriptures, so Luke, the historian, calls Lazarus one that was in Abraham's bosom, his soul. And we find Matthew asking the question, what shall a man be profited if he gains the whole world and lose his soul? Sometimes the word soul is used just to describe the whole man. Thus we find that the record says in 1 Peter, the 3rd chapter, that in the ark, while it was preparing, wherein few, that is, 8 souls were saved by water. The whole man was saved in that ark. The body, the soul, and the spirit. And when we look at the account that Luke gives in the book of Acts of the beginning of the church, we find that Luke records of the conversions of the day of Pentecost, that there were added unto them that day about 3,000 souls. God created the soul. He put it in man because the soul is the eternal part of man and is created in God's image and likeness. And because the body is that's mortal and the soul or the spirit is immortal, God did have plans for that part of man that's immortal. He's going to destroy the earth. But man has an immortal part of him that will not be destroyed. What's God's intentions for that? God's intentions for that is that when he comes again, he will open the graves of all that have died and give to them an immortal body. God would desire that every person be able to then go where those that have faithfully served him go. For the record says God's not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. But unfortunately, not all people will obey God. And because they will not occupy a place in heaven. God's prepared for such beings as that. He's prepared a place called torment. Now, every one of us are going to ultimately have an immortal body. And every one of us are going to spend eternity somewhere. If we obey God, it will be for our joy and eternal bliss in heaven. But if we disobey God and disregard his entreaties to us to come to me, and we turn a deaf ear to that invitation, we will spend eternity somewhere, my friend. But it won't be heaven. Hades, the place where the spirit goes, will someday be emptied. And that spirit there will be united with the body. And all of those bodies that will be given to the spirits that are in Hades will stand before judgment and be judged. I'll be there. You will be there. And what will our destiny be? God doesn't want us to be lost, but we have to love him. And loving him means that we keep his commandments. Thank you for listening. May God bless you and yours.